Every once in a while, as you're doom scrolling through your platform of choice, you'll come across something that makes your brain skip a beat. And I don't mean something especially shocking or offensive. It's the sort of thing where the only appropriate reaction is, okay. What is this? As I sit here, failing to meaningfully put this feeling to words, this panel from the now 49-year-old newspaper comic Heathcliff manages to embody it better than I ever could. If somebody who was completely unfamiliar with Heathcliff saw this without any context, which, hey, there's a good chance that's you, I don't think anybody would fault them for being confused. It's a very special flavor of self-referential humor, and that's probably the reason it took me so long to appreciate the series for what it actually is. As we stare at this image, the uninitiated might assume that this entire comic is going to be weird for the sake of being weird. I'm not going to pretend it's more deep than it actually is. I mean, look at it. But it's really easy to write this franchise off as just another long-running newspaper comic, and I think that would be doing it a huge disservice. If you were to compare it to a similarly formatted series, such as The Far Side, they have a decent amount in common. Single panel, caption at the bottom, generally just kinda weird. But the fundamental difference between the two is that, unlike Heathcliff, pretty much any singular panel from The Far Side can be appreciated on its own. There's no reliance on running jokes or references to anything other than common knowledge. It can exist in a vacuum and still be pretty funny. Heathcliff is not this way. That isn't to say it's not funny, because I genuinely think it is. But as a series built on running gags that were weird to begin with, they've slowly compounded over the decades to become something new, something bigger. It can be a lot to try to take in all at once. To truly understand modern Heathcliff requires the reader to go on a transformative journey. The acquired tastes need time to develop. One cannot become a connoisseur overnight, but I'm going to speed this process up as fast as I can with this video. So, let's talk about Heathcliff. The year is 1970. Everybody has a mustache, including women and children. Shag carpeting from the floors to the toilets. Something about bell-bottom jeans, probably. New Jersey cartoonist George Gately Gallagher's comic strip Hippie is published in its final newspaper. It was only in syndication from 1967 to 1969, with the next year seeing a small trickle of reruns before fizzling out entirely. And as it would turn out, creating an entire series based on a short-lived counterculture movement, a series that seems largely to be a criticism of the length of people's hair and the frequency of their bathing habits, wasn't a formula for success, but George was an advertising agent, a position he used to leverage his way into getting his cartoons published in the local papers. And while short-lived, Hippie was actually his second comic, with his at the time still running series Hapless Harry continuing from 1965 to as late as 1971, though the exact dates are admittedly a little bit unclear. In fact, there's really not a lot about George that I can find online outside of an extremely brief Wikipedia article and bits and pieces on various unofficial blogs. The majority of his work isn't published anywhere online, at least not in any official capacity, and a lot of it is dangerously close to becoming lost media. But by 1973, his most successful piece of work, Heathcliff, was published by the McNaught Syndicate in around 200 newspapers across the US. And similar to everything else he worked on, there's really not a lot known about it outside of the comic itself. As well known and long-running as this series is, the most information I can find about it is, sadly, from George's obituary. Heathcliff, named after the character from Wuthering Heights, was created after toying around with something based on a household pet. There were enough dogs around that he thought a cat would be successful, according to John Gallagher, George's older brother. George and John were both professional cartoonists who attended the Pratt Institute studying illustration, and John became a successful cartoonist for multiple newspapers and magazines with the signature Gallagher. So to avoid confusion between the two, George signed the first Heathcliff panel with his middle name, Gately. Speaking of the first Heathcliff panel, it was a 70s newspaper comic. Its contemporaries were Marmaduke and the Family Circus, whose respective punchlines were, "Dog is big," and "Children are stupid." This was their formula for success since the 60s, and neither have really deviated from those ideas in the over half century since then. But the same can't be said for Heathcliff. According to John, the longer they drew the panels, the more the character took on a life of his own. We see Heathcliff slowly transition from a slightly wackier than usual house cat to somebody with an arrest record that gets summoned for court hearings. His dad, who is also a cat, regularly escapes from prison. Heathcliff was adopted by Grandma Nutmeg with the running gag of Grandpa Nutmeg really doesn't like that gosh darn cat being one of the main through lines. The Nutmeg's grandchild, Iggy, sees Heathcliff more as a brother than a pet, and this is the way things have been from the beginning. Outside of Heathcliff's adoptive family, his convict father, and occasionally appearing girlfriend Sonia, the series doesn't really have any actual characters, at least none that have ever been explored in any meaningful way. But Heathcliff himself slowly changed over the years, less as a form of development and more as a side effect of the comic becoming increasingly ridiculous. This was, more or less, the series' status quo from the early 80s up until somewhat recently. The comic's current writer and illustrator, Peter Gallagher, started working on the series as early as 1994, with an effort made to emulate the style and comedy of his uncles. As an endeavor between two brothers, Heathcliff has always been a family business, so who better to take over the series than the nephew of the man who created it? Pete took over the comic entirely by 1998, putting his uncle's signature on the panels instead of his own, which continued even a few years after Gately's death in 2001.
Heathcliff has always been a part of my family. I tend to think a lot of times newspaper comics are like a family hardware store. You know your uncle works there. You're comfortable in the shop, and then you end up working for him and taking the place over someday.
It was this philosophy that carried the comic from the early 2000s onward. The humor was made a little bit more modern, and it was otherwise meant to feel like a seamless continuation of the series as it always had been. But Peter started taking the comic in a much more surrealist direction throughout the years, and this is the version of Heathcliff that is by far my favorite. And I want to reiterate this. I genuinely really like Heathcliff, but it took me a while to get here, which brings us back to this panel from March 25th, 2022. By this point, Peter Gallagher has been spearheading the series for longer than George or John ever did. And if I haven't managed to convince you that this is funny, this means you're in stage 1 of the 5 stages of Heath. Cliff. Denial. I'll admit, I spent a good amount of time here myself. Heathcliff's popularity peaked in the 80s with the advent of 2 separate TV series, and after they ended, he slipped outside of the general public consciousness while his biggest rival, Garfield, managed to gain an even larger foothold. The newspapers that made their way to my house growing up never actually had Heathcliff in them, so I managed to go the majority of my life without even realizing this series existed. I think somebody made a joke about it in a podcast, and wanting to loop myself in, I went to Google Images to try to understand what they were talking about. With no context or preparation, the first Heathcliff comic I ever saw was this. And having no foreknowledge of the references or inside jokes, I had the first of many beat-skipping brain moments which weren't alleviated the more I read. My and many people's immediate inclination is to compare this series to Garfield, which you'd be forgiven for doing so because he's probably the first orange cartoon cat to pop into your head when you think of newspaper comics. But that comparison is where this whole thing falls apart. These comics could not be more different. It almost feels irresponsible to make a video about Heathcliff without at least mentioning Garfield, because their legacies are inextricably linked to each other. And it's really unfortunate, because in addition to being the better of the 2 comics, Heathcliff had a 5-year head start, but pales in comparison to the level of international recognizability that Garfield is still somehow able to maintain. I've already spent a good chunk of time explaining why this is, so I'm not going to retread that ground. Click the thing in the corner of the thing if you haven't seen the other video. The comics themselves have almost nothing in common, other than their protagonists are orange, but the artists behind them came from surprisingly similar places. George Gately was a New Jersey marketing agent, and Jim Davis had the same position in Indiana. George and Jim both started comics that were published in local papers but failed to gain national syndication, at least right up until they made a series about a fat orange cat. Except Heathcliff was published in 1973, with Garfield in 78. But in the span of less than 3 years, Jim was able to sell over 1 million copies of his Garfield anthologies, and that traction showed no signs of stopping. So much so that Heathcliff felt the need to compensate by reiterating that, no, he was the original orange cat. And it's this inseparable association with Garfield that causes so many people to see this and think, well, wait, where's the punchline? Garfield is a traditional 3-panel strip, which makes it really easy to have a setup, follow-through, and a punchline. Does it make it funnier? The format of the 3-panel strip makes it really easy to have a sense of flow. You know that the intention is comedy, so panel 3 is where the joke is supposed to live. Heathcliff's formatting isn't really conducive to the traditional flow of most jokes, so you've got to pack everything into one panel. Personally, I think the absence of information is partially why it's so funny, but when you make a comic based on self-referential humor, it requires a level of familiarity with the series, and especially with one that emphasizes surrealism, it also kind of requires you to turn off your brain a little bit. Failing to do both of these things can lead to the second stage of Heath: anger. Heathcliff is the kind of comic where if you get it, you get it, but you kind of have to understand how the author ticks. And that level of understanding doesn't come until you've read a lot of them, or at the very least until you get to know Peter Gallagher's sense of humor a little better. Attempting to dissect an individual Heathcliff panel when you're missing the sometimes years of context you need to understand what's happening can cause a level of cognitive dissonance that might just make you mad. So let's do that. We're going to take a look at a single panel, forget everything we know about the series up to this point, and just take it at face value. Oh boy, okay. Where to start? Okay, so he's the unofficial mascot of Garbage Night. I suppose Garbage Night is something to be celebrated. We've got the cheerleaders to make that much clear. The garbage collectors are doing something that the cats are excited enough about to have a mascot for, which I guess is Heathcliff, but if he's the mascot, he could just be himself. There's really no reason to wear a giant mask of your own head. Maybe the joke is that cats love rummaging through garbage, so Garbage Night is like a weekly holiday, but the garbage collectors are removing it. So if they're garbage enthusiasts, wouldn't Garbage Night be their least favorite time of the week? Do they hate the garbage, so they're celebrating the fact that it's getting removed? Does garbage even get collected at night? Okay, look, this is probably a hard one to start with. Even as somebody who's been reading Heathcliff for years, there's a lot to unpack here. So let's pick apart a slightly easier one in a much more mundane scenario. Alright, there could be a couple layers here, but I think the most obvious one is that he woke up at an unreasonably late time. Ha ha ha, look at him, he's lazy, which is kind of what cats are famous for. Sleeping is like their whole thing. He's wearing a bathrobe, which maybe that's a joke on cat doing people things, but in all the other issues he's nude, so I don't know why putting on a bathrobe signifies having just woken up. That robe doesn't even cover up any of his important bits either. Okay, actually, wait a sec. Can cats drink coffee? Huh. Okay. Okay, so maybe the joke is that Heathcliff is going to die. This is fun. Okay, this is supposed to be the anger section, but I'm having fun here, so we're going to do one more. Okay, so Heathcliff is on his way somewhere. I'm going to guess outside. Dirt helmet, nice dirt color. So the real question is, why is that making her nervous? Is he going to the dirt or coming from it? Or is he planning on bringing it inside? And why does he have to have a bespoke dirt helmet to do his dirty deeds? Okay, look, I'm undermining my own point. 2 years ago, when I thought too hard about Heathcliff, it made me mad, but now it's just making it funnier. And I think a lot of that is because of how I processed the third stage of Heath: bargaining. Heathcliff was never a part of my childhood. I had no nostalgia for the TV show, I never read the comic. I discovered Heathcliff in my 20s in the age of the internet, which meant coming across one comic that confused me just led me to read another, and another, and another, until I was reading hundreds of them in a short period of time, which is probably not how this comic is meant to be digested, but I desperately wanted to understand it. So I decided to create a database. a systematic catalog of every single Heathcliff panel, with references to recurring jokes, characters, locations, until I had a spreadsheet where I could easily tell you every time he put on a helmet, or knocked over a garbage can, or shot himself out of a cannon, or hung out with a robot, and I very quickly realized that, man, this comic has a lot of stuff going on. Like a lot of stuff. It's been going for 48 years, so there was no way I was going to be able to do that on my own. Fortunately, we have technology, so I decided to try to figure out how I could automate this process. Step one was just getting my hands on all the comics, which is fortunately not that big of a deal thanks to GoComics.com. The only real downside is that they go as far back as 2002, which means I'd only be able to catalog the Peter Gallagher era panels. Which is fine, because that's when the series really transitioned into surrealism, and that's what I'm after. Step 2 was figuring out a way to consistently transcribe the caption at the bottom of the comic into plain, searchable text. And I had a bunch of ideas on how to do that, but I very quickly realized I was out of my depth. So I consulted my older brother, who's better at this than I am, and we figured out the most efficient way of doing things. Every Heathcliff, if you don't include the multi-panel Sunday comics, has the exact same format. Black box made of a squiggly line with the drawing inside and handwritten text underneath it. Google has what's called their Vision API, which can be used to convert text from an image into a text file. But the problem with passing Heathcliff panels through it is that it's a cartoon made of a bunch of thick black lines, so it would regularly find text where there was none and spit out transcriptions that looked like this. It's close, but that would still mean having to manually review and correct thousands of captions, and obviously neither of us wanted to do that. So the brainstorming continued. We noticed that even though the dimensions of the panel change slightly from comic to comic, the shape of the squiggly lines are exactly the same. So some code was written to specifically detect those squiggly lines, then crop out everything within it. That leaves us with just the text and nothing else. And when you apply that to every single panel, you can feed them all to the Vision API, and in about half an hour, you've got yourself a transcription of every single comic. Well, okay, all the single panel ones. We filtered out the Sunday comics because they were a lot of work to try to figure out, so we gave up. Cool. So now we have an index of about 6,000 captions, all sorted by date, and it's been insanely helpful for these videos. And for the fun of it, we decided to train a text-generating neural network on all the data we collected just to see what it would spit out. The results range from pretty impressively realistic to absolutely nonsense, but it's kind of funny to see either way. You can actually play around with it yourself on Heathcliff.AI, which is a real website that you can really visit. I post some of the funniest ones on Twitter if you want to check them out. Speaking of Twitter, my favorite part about the Heathcliff fan base is the small but dedicated following of Heath posters who, as a labor of love, make edits to the comic pretty much every day they release. If I try to go through and list them all, I'm definitely going to leave somebody out, so check out the actual Heathcliff Comics account and look at the replies. You can find a lot of them hanging out there. And if you're already a member of that Twitter community, it kind of goes without saying that the best part about it is how Peter Gallagher is also an active member himself. I don't know him personally, and I don't want to speak for him, but it feels like his new comics are influenced by the community of editors. Not only have the comics changed up a bit, his personal Twitter account will regularly like edits, and on particularly noteworthy occasions, he'll even leave a compliment or two in the comments. Say what you will about Twitter. It's mostly bad, but for creators like him, it provides a direct avenue of feedback that just wasn't around up until recently. And I think everything changed in July of 2021, where Peter did an interview with SolRad, the online literary magazine for comics, which, if you're at all interested in Heathcliff, I'd highly recommend reading the entire thing, because it really contextualizes his relationship with the comic, as well as the general response to the comic. Link in the description. The interviewer, Andrew Neal, starts the conversation with Peter by talking about an article he wrote for SolRad a few months prior, which is also definitely worth reading, but I'll summarize it as, Heathcliff is more than just weird, okay? Andrew continues the conversation. So I think, clearly, people are connecting with your work. Not everybody, because everybody doesn't connect with everything. My intent with the essay was as a response to the fact that so much of what is said about Heathcliff is just, hey, that's weird. I just kind of wanted to say, hey, there's a way to talk about these comics without just saying, this is weird over and over again. To which Peter responds, you know, it's funny. On Twitter, there's the guy who does the actual Heathcliff Comics account, and it's just gotten huge amounts of attention, which is great. And then there are a couple of other ones, and I appreciate anybody who's doing stuff, but there are guys who are just taking random Heathcliff comics and putting different captions on them, so they make absolutely no sense. I'm like, hey, come on. I'm not just doing stuff that doesn't make any sense at all, you know? I mean, it's kind of funny to see that, but it's also a little bit like, wait, I don't want people to think that's what I'm doing, you know? Oh. Yeah. Peter has almost certainly seen Heathcliff.AI. Sorry. But what really opened my eyes and made me realize that there was actually a fair amount of thought that went into every Heathcliff panel was this section of the interview where he talked about inheriting the comic from his uncles. Peter continues, "When I started doing Heathcliff, I was studying under my two uncles, George Gately and John Gallagher. And sometimes if you look back at some of the old ones, it was always a little bit offbeat, but it was traditional gag writing. And it was great. I mean, I was learning. I felt like I was going to graduate school for cartooning, you know, and before I ever took it over, I did maybe 4 years of what I would consider an apprenticeship. I was writing ideas, they would accept certain ones, they would talk to me then, and then I remember them saying, look, Heathcliff's been around for a long time. What you're going to do is ideas that we've already done. That's the first thing that's going to happen. We've done so many ideas about a cat cartoon that you're going to repeat, and so we can't use those. But after a while of doing it, I always think that the fine line you walk when you're writing gags, you know, is over-explaining it. If you over-explain it, you ruin it, and if you under-explain it, then people are confused and they don't know what to do. And after doing it for a number of years, I think that's the thing that I'm always concerned about, the amount of explaining and over-explaining. And I think I've decided on under-explaining. And it's a daily comic, so if you don't understand this one, I hope that if people read it on a regular basis, maybe they'll kind of start to understand what's going on with it. And you know what? He was spot on, because that's exactly what happened with me. I didn't get it, and I legitimately thought it was just weird for the sake of being weird. But this interview completely changed my perspective, and I think it did the same with a lot of other people as well, because the general attitude on Twitter changed a bit too. This interview confirmed, for a lot of people, that yeah, he was reading the comments and looking at our edits. He's not some billionaire business magnate like Jim Davis, he's a regular guy, which is partly what I find so special about the Twitter community. From the time of this interview onward, the general attitude was way more positive, and now that Peter's interacting with us, it makes the whole thing feel like a fun little fan club. But the interview does raise a valid point. If you over-explain it, you ruin it, and if you under-explain it, then people are confused and they don't know what to do. So, if the comedy of Heathcliff hasn't quite clicked with you yet, I'm gonna blast through some panels and explain to you in the most concise way I possibly can why they're actually funny, even if you don't get it yet, which we're gonna have to save for the third and final part of this series. We started working on these videos back in 2020, so a fair amount of work and rework and rework has gone into them. The delays between uploads may or may not have something to do with a crippling satisfactory addiction, but that's a topic for another day. I think it's hilarious that a meme my editor threw together in like 10 minutes has literally 100 times more views than everything else on our channel combined, but I am not one to question the ways of the mighty YouTube algorithm. If you're subscribed to this channel already and we're expecting to see another meme, sorry to disappoint you there, but if you're not subscribed, well, you already made it this far, so you probably don't hate it here. More video essay type stuff to come if you're into that sort of thing. And if you're not, I don't care, I'm just making stuff I want to make. The third and final piece of this series is already decently far into production, so it shouldn't be another 7 months before it's uploaded. So yeah, thanks for sticking around. How do people end videos?